Chapter 1. The Present Position of the Rupee. 1. On the broad historical facts relating to Indian currency, I do not intend to spend time. It is sufficiently well known that until 1893 the currency of India was on the basis of silver freely minted, the gold value of the rupee fluctuating with the gold value of silver bullion. By the depreciation in the gold value of silver, extending over a long period of years, trade was inconvenienced and public finance, by reason of the large payments which the government must make in sterling, gravely disturbed, until in 1893, after the breakdown of negotiations for bimetallism, the Indian mints were closed to the free mintage of silver, and the value of the rupee divorced from the value of the metal contained in it. By withholding new issues of currency, the government had succeeded by 1899 in raising the gold value of the rupee to ones for D, at which figure it has remained without sensible variation ever since. 2. There can be no doubt that at first the government of India did not fully understand the nature of the new system, and that several minor mistakes were made at its inception. But few are now found who dispute on broad general grounds the wisdom of the change from a silver to a gold standard. Time has muffled the outcries of the silver interests, and time has also dealt satisfactorily with what were originally the principal grounds of criticism, namely, 1. That the new system was unstable, 2. That a depreciating currency is advantageous to a country's foreign trade. 3. The second of these complaints was urged with great persistency in 1893. The depreciating rupee acted, it was said, as a bounty to exporters, and the introduction of a gold standard, so it was argued, would greatly injure the export trade in tea, corn, and manufactured cotton. It was plainly pointed out by theorists at the time that the advantage to exporters was largely at the expense of other members of the community and could not profit the country as a whole, and b. that it could only be temporary. The recent spell of rising prices in India has shown clearly in how many ways a depreciating currency damages large sections of the community, although it may temporarily benefit other sections. In fact, some recent complaints against the existing currency policy have been occasioned by the tendency of prices to rise, whereas it is plain that the great change of 1893 must have tended to make them fall. 3. And that rupee prices would, in all probability, be higher than they now are if the change had not been effected. With regard to the temporary nature of the effect on exporters, experience has decisively supported theory. The nature of this experience was admirably summed up by Mr. J. B. Brunyate in the Legislative Council, February 25, 1910. Speaking in reply to the similar line of argument brought forward by the Bombay mill owning interests in connection with the imposition in 1910 of a duty on silver. 1. 4. The criticisms of 1893, therefore, are no longer heard, and the currency problems with which we are now confronted are new. The evolution of the Indian currency system since 1899 has been rapid, though silent. There have been few public pronouncements of policy on the part of government, and the legislative changes have been inconsiderable. Yet a system has been developed which was contemplated neither by those who affected nor by those who opposed the closing of the mints in 1893, and which was not favored either by the government or by the Fowler Committee in 1899, although something like it was suggested at that time. It is not possible to point to any one date at which the currency policy now in force was deliberately adopted. The fact that the government of India have drifted into a system and have never set it forth plainly is partly responsible for a widespread misunderstanding of its true character. But this economy of explanation, from which the system has suffered in the past, does 5. Not make it any the worse intrinsically. The prophecy made before the committee of 1898 by Mr. A. M. Lindsay, in proposing a scheme closely similar in principle to that which was eventually adopted, has been largely fulfilled. This change, he said, will pass unnoticed except by the intelligent few, and it is satisfactory to find that by this almost imperceptible process the Indian currency will be placed on a footing which Ricardo and other great authorities have advocated as the best of all currency systems, viz. one in which the currency media used in the internal circulation are confined to notes and cheap token coins, which are made to act precisely as if they were bits of gold by being made convertible into gold for foreign payment purposes. 5. In 1893, 4 possible bases of currency seemed to hold the field: debased and depreciating currencies, usually of paper, silver, bimetallism, and gold. It was not to be supposed that the government of India intended to adopt the first. The second they were avowedly upsetting. The third they had attempted and had failed to obtain by negotiation. It seemed to follow that their ultimate objective must be the last, namely a currency of gold. The Committee of 1892 did not commit themselves, but the system which their recommendations established was generally supposed to be transitional and a first step towards the introduction of gold. The Committee of 1898 explicitly declared themselves to be 6 in favor of the eventual establishment of a gold currency. This goal, if it was their goal, the government of India have never attained. The rupee is still the principal medium of exchange and is of unlimited legal tender. There is no legal enactment compelling any authority to redeem rupees with gold. The fact that since 1899 the gold value of the rupee has only fluctuated within narrow limits is solely due to administrative measures which the government are under no compulsion to undertake. What, then, is the present position of the rupee? 6. The main features of the Indian system as now established are as follows. 1. The rupee is unlimited legal tender and, so far as the law provides, inconvertible. 2. The sovereign is unlimited legal tender at £1 to 15 rupees, and is convertible at this rate, so long as a notification issued in 1893 is not withdrawn, i.e., the government can be required to give 15 rupees in exchange for £1. 3. As a matter of administrative practice, the government is, as a rule, willing to give sovereigns for rupees at this rate. But the practice is sometimes suspended and large quantities of gold cannot always be obtained in India by tendering rupees. 4. As a matter of administrative practice, the government will sell in Calcutta, in return for rupees tendered there, bills payable in London in sterling 7 at a rate not more unfavorable than one's 329/32d per rupee. The fourth of these provisions is the vital one for supporting the sterling value of the rupee, and, although the government have given no binding undertaking to maintain it, a failure to do so might fairly be held to involve an utter breakdown of their system. Thus, the second provision prevents the sterling value of the rupee from rising above one's 4d by more than the cost of remitting sovereigns to India, and the fourth provision prevents it from falling below one's 329/32d. This means in practice that the extreme limits of variation of the sterling value of the rupee are one's for 1/8 d and one's 329/32. 7. The important characteristics of the Indian system are so much a matter of notification and administrative practice that it is impossible to point to single acts which have made the system what it is. But the following list of dates may be useful for purposes of reference. 1892. Herschel Committee on Indian Currency. 1893. Act closing the Indian mints to the coinage of silver on private account. Notifications by government fixing the rate at which rupees or notes would be supplied in exchange for the tender of gold, at the equivalent of one's for d. The rupee. 1898. Fowler Committee on Indian Currency. Exchange value of rupee touched one's for d. 1899. Act declaring the British sovereign legal tender at one's for d. to the rupee. 1899 to 1903. Negotiations for coinage of sovereigns in India. Dropped indefinitely February 6, 1903. 1900. Gold Standard Reserve instituted out of profits of coinage. 1904. Secretary of State's notification of his willingness to sell council bills on India at one's for 1/8 d. The rupee without limit. 1905. Act authorizing the establishment of the currency chest of earmarked gold at the Bank of England as part of the currency reserve against notes. 2. And the investment of a stated part of the currency reserve in sterling securities. 1906. The notification withdrawn which had directed the issue of rupees against the tender of gold, as distinguished from British gold coin. 1907. Rupee branch of the Gold Standard Reserve instituted. 1908. Sterling drafts sold in Calcutta on London at once. 329/32D. The rupee, and cashed out of funds from the Gold Standard Reserve. 1910. Act rendering currency notes of 10 rupees and 50 universal legal tender. 3. And directing the issue of notes in exchange for British gold coins. 1913. Royal Commission on Indian Finance and Currency. 8. In Section 6 I have stated the practical effect of these successive measures. But the legal position is so complicated and peculiar that it will be worth while to state it quite precisely. Previous to 1893, the government were bound by the Coinage Act of 1870 to issue rupees, weight for weight, in exchange for silver bullion. There was also in force a notification of the Governor-General in Council, dating from 1868, 9 by which sovereigns were received at government treasuries as the equivalent of 10 rupees and 4 annas. This notification, which had superseded a notification of 1864 fixing the exchange at 10 rupees, had long been inoperative, as the gold exchange value of 10 rupees 4 annas had fallen much below a sovereign. The Act of 1893 was merely a repealing act, necessary in order to do away with those provisions of the Act of 1870 which provided for the free mintage of silver into rupees. At the same time, 1893, the notification of 1868 was superseded by a new notification fixing 15 rupees as the rate at which sovereigns would be accepted at government treasuries, and a notification was issued under the Paper Currency Act of 1882, directing the issue of currency notes in exchange for gold at the 15 rupees to 1 pound ratio. The direct issue of rupees against the tender of gold also has been regulated by a series of notifications, of which the first was published in 1893, up to 1906 rupees being issued against either gold coin or gold bullion, and since 1906 against sovereigns and half-sovereigns only. Apart from notifications, an Act of 1899 declared British sovereigns legal tender at the 15 rupees to 1 pound ratio, an indirect effect of which was to make it possible for government, so far as acts are concerned, to redeem notes in gold coin and refuse silver. And lastly, the Paper Currency Act of 1910 bound the government to issue notes against the tender of British gold coin. 10. The convertibility of the sovereign into rupees at the 15 rupees to 1 pound ratio is not laid down, therefore, in any act whatever. It depends on notifications withdrawable by the executive at will. Further, the management of the Gold Standard Reserve is governed neither by act nor by notification, but by administrative practice solely, and the sale of council bills on India and of sterling drafts on London is regulated by announcements changeable at administrative discretion from time to time. All this emphasizes the gradual nature of the system's growth and the transitional character of existing legislation. As matters now are, there is something to be said for a new act, which, while leaving administrative discretion free where there is still good ground for this, might consolidate and clarify the position. 9. As a result of these various measures, the rupee remains the local currency in India, but the government take precautions for ensuring its convertibility into international currency at an approximately stable rate. The stability of the Indian system depends upon their keeping sufficient reserves of coined rupees to enable them at all times to exchange international currency for local currency, and sufficient liquid resources in sterling to enable them to change back the local currency into international currency, whenever they are required to do so. The special features of the system, although, as we shall see later, these features are not in fact by any means peculiar to India, are, first, that the actual medium of exchange is a local currency distinct from the international currency. Second, that the government is more ready to redeem the local currency, rupees, in bills payable in international currency, gold, at a foreign center, London, than to redeem it outright locally. And third, that the government, having taken on itself the responsibility for providing local currency in exchange for international currency, and for changing back local currency into international currency when required, must keep two kinds of reserves, one for each of these purposes. I will deal with these characteristics in successive chapters. It is convenient to begin with the second of them and at the outset to discuss in a general way the system of currency, of which the Indian is the most salient example, known to students as the gold exchange standard. Then we will take the first of them in chapters 3 and 4, on paper currency and on the present position of gold in India and proposals for a gold currency, and the third in chapter 6, on the Secretary of State's reserves. 10. But before we pass to these several features of the Indian system, it will be worthwhile to emphasize two respects in which this system is not peculiar. In the first place, a system in which the rupee is maintained at once. For d. By regulation, does not affect 12 the level of prices differently from the way in which it would be affected by a system in which the rupee was a gold coin worth ones. For d. Except in a very indirect and unimportant way to be explained in a moment. So long as the rupee is worth ones. For d. In gold, no merchant or manufacturer considers of what material it is made when he fixes the price of his product. The indirect effect on prices, due to the rupees being silver, is similar to the effect of the use of any medium of exchange, such as checks or notes, which economizes the use of gold. If the use of gold is economized in any country, gold throughout the world is less valuable. Gold prices, that is to say, are higher. But as this effect is shared by the whole world, the effect on prices in any country of economies in the use of gold made by that country is likely to be relatively slight. In short, a policy which led to a greater use of gold in India would tend, by increasing the demand for gold in the world's markets, somewhat to lower the level of world prices as measured in gold. But it would not cause any alteration worth considering in the relative rates of exchange of Indian and non-Indian commodities. In the second place, although it is true that the maintenance of the rupee at or near ones, for d. is due to regulation, it is not true when once ones, for d. rather than some other gold value has been determined, that the volume of currency in circulation depends in the least upon the policy of the government or the caprice 13 of an official. For this part of the system is as perfectly automatic as in any other country. The government has put itself under an obligation to supply rupees whenever sovereigns are tendered, and it often permits or encourages the tender of sovereigns in London as well as in India, but it has no power or opportunity of forcing rupees into circulation otherwise. In two matters only does the government use a discretionary power. First, in order that it may always be possible to fulfill this obligation, it is necessary to keep a certain reserve of coined rupees, just as some authority in this country, in point of fact the Bank of England, must keep some reserve of token silver and coined sovereigns and not hold in its vaults too large a proportion of uncoined or foreign gold. The magnitude of this reserve is within the discretion of the Indian government. To a certain extent, they must anticipate probable demands on the output of the mint. But if they miscalculate and mint more than they need, the new rupees must lie in the government's own chests until they are wanted, and the date at which they emerge into circulation it is beyond the power of the government to determine. In the second 14 place, the government can postpone for a short time a demand for rupees by refusing to supply them in return for sovereigns tendered in London and by insisting upon the sovereigns being sent to Calcutta. Sometimes they do this, but very often it is worth their while, for reasons to be explained in detail later on, to accept the tender of sovereigns in London. In either of these cases, the permanent effect of their action one way or the other on the volume of circulation is inconsiderable. The kind of difference it makes is comparable to the difference which would be made if it lay within the discretion of a government to charge or not, as it saw fit, a small brassage not much greater than the cost of coining. Chapter 2. The Gold Exchange Standard. 1. If we are to see the Indian system in its proper perspective, it is necessary to digress for a space to a discussion of currency evolution in general. My purpose is, first, to show that the British system is peculiar and is not suited to other conditions. Second, that the conventional idea of sound currency is chiefly derived from certain superficial aspects of the British system. Third, that a somewhat different type of system has been developed in most other countries. And fourth, that in essentials the system which has been evolved in India conforms to this foreign type. I shall be concerned throughout this chapter with the general characteristics of currency systems, not with the details of their working. 2. The history of currency, so far as it is relevant to our present purpose, virtually begins with the 19th century. During the second quarter of this century, England was alone in possessing an orthodox sound currency on a gold basis. Gold was the sole standard of value. It circulated freely from hand to hand, and it was freely available for export. Up to 1844, banknotes showed a tendency to become a formidable rival to gold as the actual medium of exchange. But the Bank Act of that year set itself to hamper this tendency and to encourage the use of gold as the medium of exchange as well as the standard of value. This act was completely successful in stopping attempts to economize gold by the use of notes. But the Bank Act did nothing to hinder the use of checks, and the very remarkable development of this medium of exchange during the next 50 years led in this country, without any important development in the use of notes or tokens, to a monetary organization more perfectly adapted for the economy of gold than any which exists elsewhere. In this matter of the use of checks, Great Britain has been followed by the rest of the English-speaking world, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and the United States of America. But in other countries, currency evolution has been chiefly along different lines. 3. In the early days of banking of the modern type in England, gold was not infrequently required to meet runs on banks by their depositors, who were always liable in difficult times to fall into a state of panic lest they should be unable to withdraw their deposits in case of real need. With the growth of the stability of banking, and especially with the growth of confidence in this stability amongst 17 depositors, these occasions have become more and more infrequent, and many years have now passed since there has been any run of dangerous proportions on English banks. Gold reserves, therefore, in Great Britain are no longer held primarily with a view to emergencies of this kind. The uses of gold coin in Great Britain are now 3, as the medium of exchange for certain kinds of out-of-pocket expenditure, such as that on railway traveling, for which custom requires cash payment, for the payment of wages, and to meet a drain of specie abroad. Fluctuations in the demand for gold in the first 2 uses are of secondary importance, and can usually be predicted with a good deal of accuracy, at holiday seasons, at the turn of the quarter, at the end of the week, at harvest. Fluctuations in the demand in the third use are of greater magnitude and, apart from the regular autumn drain, not so easily foreseen. Our gold reserve policy is mainly dictated, therefore, by considerations arising out of the possible demand for export. To guard against a possible drain of gold abroad, a complicated mechanism has been developed which in the details of its working is peculiar to this country. A drain of gold can only come about if foreigners choose to turn into gold claims, which they have against us for immediate payment, and we have no counterbalancing claims against them for equally immediate payment. The drain can only be stopped 18 if we can rapidly bring to bear our counterbalancing claims. When we come to consider how this can best be done, it is to be noticed that the position of a country which is preponderantly a creditor in the international short loan market is quite different from that of a country which is preponderantly a debtor. In the former case, which is that of Great Britain, it is a question of reducing the amount lent. In the latter case, it is a question of increasing the amount borrowed. A machinery which is adapted for action of the first kind may be ill-suited for action of the second. Partly as a consequence of this, partly as a consequence of the peculiar organization of the London money market, the bank rate policy for regulating the outflow of gold has been admirably successful in this country, and yet cannot stand elsewhere unaided by other devices. It is not necessary for the purposes of this survey to consider precisely how changes in the bank rate affect the balance of immediate indebtedness. It will be sufficient to say that it tends to hamper the brokers, who act as middlemen between the British short loan fund and the foreign demand for accommodation, chiefly materialized in the offer of bills for discount, and to cause them to enter into a less volume of new business than that of the short loans formerly contracted and now falling due, thus bringing to bear the necessary counterbalancing claims against foreign countries. 4. The essential characteristics of the British 19 monetary system are, therefore, the use of checks as the principal medium of exchange, and the use of the bank rate for regulating the balance of immediate foreign indebtedness, and hence the flow, by import and export, of gold. 5. The development of foreign monetary systems into their present shapes began in the last quarter of the 19th century. At that time London was at the height of her financial supremacy, and her monetary arrangements had stood the test of time and experience. Foreign systems, therefore, were greatly influenced at their inception by what were regarded as the fundamental tenets of the British system. But foreign observers seem to have been more impressed by the fact that the Englishman had sovereigns in his pocket than by the fact that he had a checker book in his desk, and took more notice of the efficacy of the bank rate and of the deliberations of the Court of Directors on Thursdays than of the peculiar organization of the brokers and the London money market, and of Great Britain's position as a creditor nation. They were thus led to imitate the form rather than the substance. When they introduced the gold standard, they set up gold currencies as well, and in several cases an official bank rate was established on the British model. Germany led the way in 1871 to 73. Even now apologists of the Reichsbank will sometimes speak as if its bank rate were efficacious by itself in the same manner as the 20 Bank of England's. But, in fact, the German system, though ostensibly modeled in part upon the British system, has become, by force of circumstances, essentially different. It is not necessary for this survey to consider individual systems in any detail. But, confining ourselves to European countries, whether we consider, for example, France, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Italy, Sweden, or Holland, while most of these countries have a gold currency and an official bank rate, in none of them is gold the principal medium of exchange, and in none of them is the bank rate their only habitual support against an outward drain of gold. 6. With the use of substitutes for gold I will deal in Chapter 4. In treating of the proper position of gold in the Indian system. But what props are commonly brought to the support of an ineffective bank rate in countries other than Great Britain? Roughly speaking, there are 3. A very large gold reserve may be maintained, so that a substantial drain on it may be faced with equanimity. Free payments in gold may be partially suspended, or foreign credits and bills may be kept which can be drawn upon when necessary. The central banks of most European countries depend, in varying degrees, upon all 3. The Bank of France uses the first 2, 6, and her 21 holdings of foreign bills are not, at normal times, important. 7. Her bank rate is not fixed primarily with a view to foreign conditions, and a change in it is usually intended to affect home affairs, though these may of course depend and react on foreign affairs. Germany is in a state of transition, and her present position is avowedly unsatisfactory. The theory of her arrangements seems to be that she depends on her bank rate after the British model. But in practice her bank rate is not easily rendered effective, and must usually be reinforced by much unseen pressure by the Reichsbank on the other elements of the money market. Her gold reserve is not large enough for the first expedient to be used lightly. Free payment in gold is sometimes, in effect, partially suspended, 8 though covertly and with 22 shame. To an increasing extent the Reichsbank depends on variations in her holding of foreign bills and credits. A few years ago such holdings were of small importance. The table given below shows with what rapidity the part taken by foreign bills and credits in the finance of the Reichsbank has been growing. The authorities of the Reichsbank have now learnt that their position in the international short loan market is not one which permits them to fix the bank rate and then idly to await the course of events. Reichsbank's holdings of foreign bills, excluding credits, Reichsbank's holdings of foreign bills and credits with foreign correspondents on last day of each year. 7. If we pass from France, whose position as a creditor country is not altogether unlike Great Britain's, and from Germany, which is at any rate able to do a good deal towards righting the balance of immediate indebtedness by the sale of securities having an international market, to other countries of less financial strength, we find the dependence of their central banks on holdings of foreign bills and on foreign credits, their willingness to permit a premium on gold, and the inadequacy of their bank rates taken by themselves to be increasingly marked. I will first mention very briefly one or two salient facts, and will then consider their underlying meaning, always with an ultimate view to their bearing on the affairs of India. 8. To illustrate how rare a thing in Europe a perfect and automatic gold standard is, let us take the most recent occasion of stringency, November 1912. The Balkan War was at this time at an acute stage, but the European situation was only moderately anxious. Compared with the crisis at the end of 1907, the financial position was one of comparative calm. Yet in the course of that month there was a premium on gold of about 0.75% in France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, 9, and Belgium. So high a premium as this is as effective in retaining gold as a very considerable addition to the bank rate. 24. If, for example, the premium did not last more than 3 months, it would add to the profits of a temporary deposit of funds for that period as much as an addition of 3% to the discount rate. Or, to put it the other way round, there would need to be an additional profit of 3% elsewhere if it were to be worthwhile to send funds abroad. 9. The growing importance of foreign bills in the portfolios of the Reichsbank has been shown above. The importance of foreign bills and credits in the policy of the Austro-Hungarian Bank is of longer standing and is better known. They always form an important part of its reserves, and the part first utilized in times of stringency. 10. It was supposed that in the third quarter of 1911 the bank placed not less than £4 million worth of gold bills at the disposal of the Austro-Hungarian market in order to support exchange. Amongst European countries, Russia now keeps the largest aggregate of funds in foreign bills and in balances abroad, amounting in November 1912 to £26,630,000. 11. Account being taken of their total resources, however, the banks of the 3 Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, hold the 25 highest proportion in the form of balances abroad, amounting in November 1912, for the 3 countries in the aggregate to about £7 million. These are enough examples for my purpose. 10. What is the underlying significance of this growing tendency on the part of European state banks to hold a part of their reserves in foreign bills or foreign credits? We saw above that the bank rate policy of the Bank of England is successful because by indirect means it causes the money market to reduce its short period loans to foreign countries, and thus to turn the balance of immediate indebtedness in our favor. This indirect policy is less feasible in countries where the money market is already a borrower rather than a lender in the international market. In such countries, a rise in the bank rate cannot be relied on to produce the desired effect with due rapidity. A direct policy on the part of the central bank, therefore, must be employed. If the money market is not a lender in the international market, the bank itself must be at pains to become to some extent one. The Bank of England lends to middlemen who, by holding bills or otherwise, lend abroad. A rise in the bank rate is equivalent to putting pressure on these middlemen to diminish their commitments. In countries where the money market is neither so highly developed nor, in relation to foreign countries, so self-supporting, the central bank, if it is to be secure, must take the matter 26 in hand itself and, by itself entering the international money market as a lender at short notice, place itself in funds at foreign centers, which can be rapidly withdrawn when they are required. The only alternative would be the holding of a much larger reserve of gold, the expense of which would be nearly intolerable. The new method combines safety with economy. Just as individuals have learnt that it is cheaper and not less safe to keep their ultimate reserves on deposit at their bankers than to keep them at home in cash, so the second stage of monetary evolution is now entered on, and nations are learning that some part of the cash reserves of their banks, we cannot go further than this at present, may be properly kept on deposit in the international money market. This is not the expedient of second-rate or impoverished countries. It is the expedient of all those who have not attained a high degree of financial supremacy, of all those, in fact, who are not themselves international bankers. 11. In the 40 years, therefore, during which the world has been coming on to a gold standard, without, however, giving up for that reason its local currencies of notes or token silver, two devices, apart from the bullion reserve itself and the bank rate, have been evolved for protecting the local currencies. The first is to permit a small variation in the ratio of exchange between the local currency and gold, amounting perhaps to an occasional premium 27 of 3/4% on the latter. This may help to tide over a stringency which is seasonal or of short duration without raising to a dangerous level the rate of discount on purely local transactions. The second is for the government or central bank to hold resources available abroad, which can be used for maintaining the gold parity of the local currency, when there is the need for it. 12. We are now more nearly in a position to come back to the currency of India herself, and to see it in its proper relation to those of other countries. At one end of the scale we have Great Britain and France, creditor nations in the short loan market. 12. In an intermediate position comes Germany, a creditor in relation to many of her neighbors, but apt to be a debtor in relation to France, Great Britain, and the United States. Next come such countries as Russia and Austria-Hungary, rich and powerful, with immense reserves of gold, but debtor nations, dependent in the short loan market on their neighbors. From the currencies of these it is an easy step to those of the great trading nations of Asia, India, Japan, and the Dutch East Indies. 13. I say that from the currencies of such countries as Russia and Austria-Hungary to those which have 28 explicitly and in name a gold exchange standard. 13. It is an easy step. The gold exchange standard is simply a more regularized form of the same system as theirs. In their essential characteristics and in the monetary logic which underlies them, the currencies of India and Austria-Hungary, to take these as our examples, are not really different. In India we know the extreme limits of fluctuation in the exchange value of the rupee. We know the precise volume of reserves which the government holds in gold and in credits abroad, and we know at what moment the government will step in and utilize these resources for the support of the rupee. In Austria-Hungary the system is less automatic, and the bank is allowed a wide discretion. In detail, of course, there are a number of differences. India keeps a somewhat higher proportion of her reserves in foreign credits, and keeps some part of these credits in a less liquid form. She also keeps a portion of her gold reserve in London, a practice made possible by the fact that for India London is not strictly a foreign center. On the other hand, India is probably more willing than the Bank of Austria-Hungary to supply gold on demand. If we are to judge from the experience of 29 recent years, India inclines to use her gold reserves, Austria-Hungary her foreign credits, first. But in the essentials of the gold exchange standard, the use of a local currency mainly not of gold, some degree of unwillingness to supply gold locally in exchange for the local currency, but a high degree of willingness to sell foreign exchange for payment in local currency at a certain maximum rate, and to use foreign credits in order to do this, the two countries agree. 14. To say that the gold exchange standard merely carries somewhat further the currency arrangements which several European countries have evolved during the last quarter of a century is not, of course, to justify it. But if we see that the gold exchange standard is not, in the currency world of today, anomalous, and that it is in the mainstream of currency evolution, we shall have a wider experience on which to draw in criticizing it, and may be in a better position to judge of its details wisely. Much nonsense is talked about a gold standards properly carrying a gold currency with it. If we mean by a gold currency a state of affairs in which gold is the principal or even, in the aggregate, a very important medium of exchange, no country in the world has such a thing. 14. Gold is an international but not a local currency. The currency problem of each country is to ensure that they shall run no risk of being 30 unable to put their hands on international currency when they need it, and to waste as small a proportion of their resources on holdings of actual gold as is compatible with this. The proper solution for each country must be governed by the nature of its position in the international money market and of its relations to the chief financial centers, and by those national customs in matters of currency which it may be unwise to disturb. It is as an attempt to solve this problem that the gold exchange standard ought to be judged. 15. We have been concerned so far with transitional systems of currency. I will conclude this chapter with a brief history in outline of the gold exchange standard itself. It will then be time to pass from high generalities to the actual details of the Indian system. The gold exchange standard arises out of the discovery that, so long as gold is available for payments of international indebtedness at an approximately constant rate in terms of the national currency, it is a matter of comparative indifference whether it actually forms the national currency. The gold exchange standard may be said to exist when gold does not circulate in a country to an appreciable extent, when the local currency is not necessarily redeemable in gold, but when the government or central bank makes arrangements for the provision of foreign remittances in gold at a fixed 31 maximum rate in terms of the local currency, the reserves necessary to provide these remittances being kept to a considerable extent abroad. A system closely resembling the gold exchange standard was actually employed during the second half of the 18th century for regulating the exchange between London and Edinburgh. Its theoretical advantages were first set forth by Ricardo at the time of the bullionist controversy. He laid it down that a currency is in its most perfect state when it consists of a cheap material, but having an equal value with the gold it professes to represent. And he suggested that convertibility for the purposes of the foreign exchanges should be ensured by the tendering on demand of gold bars, not coin, in exchange for notes, so that gold might be available for purposes of export only and would be prevented from entering into the internal circulation of the country. In an article contributed to the Contemporary Review of 1887, Dr. Marshall again brought these advantages to the notice of practical men. 16. The first crude attempt in recent times at establishing a standard of this type was made by Holland. The free coinage of silver was suspended in 1877, but the currency continued to consist mainly of silver and paper. It has been maintained since that date at a constant value in terms of gold by the banks regularly providing gold when it is required for export and by its using its authority at the same 32 time for restricting so far as possible the use of gold at home. To make this policy possible, the Bank of Holland has kept a reserve of a moderate and economical amount, partly in gold, partly in foreign bills. 15. During the long period for which this policy has been pursued, it has been severely tried more than once, but has stood the test successfully. It must be noticed, however, that although Holland has kept gold and foreign bills as a means of obtaining a credit abroad at any moment, she has not kept a standing credit in any foreign financial center. The method of keeping a token currency at a fixed par with gold by means of credit abroad was first adopted by Count Witt for Russia in the transitional period from inconvertible paper to a gold standard. In the autumn of 1892, the Department of Finance offered to buy exchange on Berlin at 2.18 marks and to sell at 2.20. In the same year, 1892, the Austro-Hungarian system, referred to above, was established. As in India, their exchange policy was evolved gradually. The present arrangements, which date 33 from 1896, were made possible by the strong preference of the public for notes over gold and by the provision of the law which permitted the holding of foreign bills as cover for the note issue. This exchange policy is the easier because the Austro-Hungarian Bank is by far the largest dealer in exchange in Vienna, just as the policy of the government of India is facilitated by the commanding influence which the system of council bills gives it over the exchange market. 17. But although India was not the first country to lead the way to a gold exchange standard, she was the first to adopt it in a complete form. When in 1893, on the recommendation of the Herschel Committee, following upon the agitation of the Indian Currency Association, the mints were closed to the free coinage of silver, it was believed that the cessation of coinage and the refusal of the Secretary of State to sell his bills below ones for d. would suffice to establish this ratio of exchange. The government had not then the experience which we have now, We now know that such measures are not by themselves sufficient, except under the influence of favoring circumstances. As a matter of fact, the circumstances were, at first, unfavorable. Exchange fell considerably below ones for D, and the Secretary of State had to sell his bills for what he could get. If there had been, at the existing level of prices, a rapidly expanding demand for currency at the time when the 34 mints were closed, the measures actually taken might very well have proved immediately successful. But the demand did not expand, and the very large issue of currency immediately before and just after the closure of the mints proved sufficient to satisfy the demand for several years to come. Just as a demand for new currency on an abnormally high scale from 1903 to 1907, accompanied by high rates of discount, was followed in 1908 by a complete cessation of demand and a period of comparatively low rates of discount. Favorable circumstances, however, came at last, and by January 1898 exchange was stable at once. For D, the Fowler Committee, then appointed, recommended a gold currency as the ultimate objective. It is since that time that the government of India have adopted, or drifted into, their present system. 18. The gold exchange standard in the form in which it has been adopted in India is justly known as the Lindsay scheme. It was proposed and advocated from the earliest discussions, when the Indian currency problem first became prominent, by Mr. A. M. Lindsay, Deputy Secretary of the Bank of Bengal, who always maintained that they must adopt my scheme despite themselves. His first proposals were made in 1876 and 1878. They were repeated in 1885 and again in 1892, when he published a pamphlet entitled Ricardo's Exchange Remedy. Finally, he explained his views in detail to the committee of 1898. 35. Lindsay's scheme was severely criticized both by government officials and leading financiers. Lord Farrer described it as far too clever for the ordinary English mind with its ineradicable prejudice for an immediately tangible gold backing to all currencies. Lord Rothschild, Sir John Lubbock, Lord Avebury, Sir Samuel Montague, the late Lord Swaithling, all gave evidence before the committee that any system without a visible gold currency would be looked on with distrust. Mr. Alfred de Rothschild went so far as to say that, in fact, a gold standard without a gold currency seemed to him an utter impossibility. Financiers of this type will not admit the feasibility of anything until it has been demonstrated to them by practical experience. It follows, therefore, that they will seldom give their support to what is new. 19. Since the Indian system has been perfected and its provisions generally known, it has been widely imitated both in Asia and elsewhere. In 1903, the government of the United States introduced a system avowedly based on it into the Philippines. Since that time, it has been established under the influence of the same government in Mexico and Panama. The government of Siam have adopted it. The French have introduced it in Indochina. Our own colonial office have introduced it in the Straits settlements and are about to introduce it into the West African colonies. Something similar has existed in Java under Dutch influences for many years. The 36 Japanese system is virtually the same in practice. In China, as is well known, currency reform has not yet been carried through. The gold exchange standard is the only possible means of bringing China onto a gold basis, and the alternative policy, the policy of our own Foreign Office, is to be content at first with a standard, as well as a currency of silver. A powerful body of opinion, led by the United States, favors the immediate introduction of a gold standard on the Indian model. It may fairly be said, therefore, that in the 10 years the gold exchange standard has become the prevailing monetary system of Asia. I have tried to show that it is also closely related to the prevailing tendencies in Europe. Speaking as a theorist, I believe that it contains one essential element, the use of a cheap local currency artificially maintained at par with the international currency or standard of value, whatever that may ultimately turn out to be, in the ideal currency of the future. But it is now time to turn to details. Chapter 3. Paper Currency. 1. The chief characteristics of the Indian system of currency have been roughly sketched in the first chapter. I will now proceed to a description of the system of note issue. 2. In existing conditions, the rupee, being a token coin, is virtually a note printed on silver. The custom and convenience of the people justify this, so far as concerns payment in small sums. But in itself it is extravagant. When rupees are issued, the government, instead of being able to place to reserve the whole nominal value of the coin, is able to retain only the difference between the nominal value and the cost of the silver. 16. For large payments, therefore, it is important to encourage the use of notes to the utmost extent possible, from the point of view of economy, because by these means the government may obtain a large part of the reserves necessary for 38, the support of a gold exchange standard, and also because only thus will it be possible to introduce a proper degree of elasticity in the seasonal supply of currency. 3. By Acts of 1839 to 43, the Presidency Banks of Bengal, Bombay, and Madras were authorized to issue notes payable on demand, but the use of the notes was practically limited to the 3 Presidency towns. 17. These acts were repealed in 1861, when the present government paper currency was first instituted. Since that time, no banks have been allowed to issue notes in India. Proposals for a government paper currency were instituted in 1859 by Mr. James Wilson on his going out to India as the first financial member. 18. Mr. Wilson died before his scheme could be carried into effect, and the act setting up the paper currency scheme, which became law in 1861, differed in some important respects from his original proposals. 19. The system was eventually set up under the influence of the very rigid ideas as to the proper regulation of note issue prevailing, as a result of the controversies which had culminated in the British Bank Act of 1844 amongst English economists of that time. According to these ideas, the proper principles of note issue 39 were two: first, that the function of note issue should be entirely dissociated from that of banking, and second, that the amount of notes issued on government securities should be maintained at a fixed sum, within the limit of the smallest amount which experience has proved to be necessary for the monetary transactions of the country, and that any further amount of notes should be issued on coin or bullion. 20. These principles were orthodox and all others unsound. The sound principle for regulating the issue of a paper circulation, wrote the Secretary of State, is that which was enforced on the Bank of England by the Act of 1844. In England, of course, bankers immediately set themselves to recover the economy and elasticity, which the Act of 1844 banished from the English system by other means, and with the development of the check system to its present state of perfection they have magnificently succeeded. In foreign countries, all kinds of new principles have been tried for the regulation of note issue, and some of them have been very successful. In India, the Creed of 1861 is still repeated, but by unforeseen chance the words have changed their meanings, and have permitted the old system to acquire through inadvertence a certain degree of usefulness. The coin, in which the greater part of the reserve had to 40 be held, was, of course, the rupee. In 1861, this was a freely minted coin worth no more than its bullion value. When the rupee became an artificially valued token, rupees tacitly remained the legitimate form of the reserve, although after a time sovereigns were added as an optional alternative. Thus the authorities are free, if they like, to hold the whole of the currency reserve in rupee tokens, and this reserve has become, therefore, as we shall see below, an important part of the mechanism by which the supply of silver rupees to the currency is duly regulated. While, however, the note issue has managed to evolve an important function for itself, I think the time has come when the usefulness of the currency reserve may be much increased by a deliberate consideration of the place it might fill in the organism of the Indian money market. I return to this later in the chapter. In the meantime, I pass to a description of the paper currency as it now is, insisting, however, that when we come to consider how it may be improved, the circumstances of its origin be not forgotten. For the first 40 years of their existence, the government notes, though always of growing importance, took a very minor place in the currency system of the country. This was partly due to an arrangement, now in gradual course of abolition, by which for the purposes of paper currency India has been divided up in effect into several separate countries. These 41 circles, as they are called, now 721 in number, correspond roughly to the principal provinces of India, the offices of issue being as follows. The currency notes 22 are in the form of promissory notes of the Government of India payable to the bearer on demand, and are of the denominations 5 rupees, 10, 50, 100, 500, 1,000, and 10,000. Thus, the lowest note is of the face value of SIXS. 8D. They are issued without limit from any paper currency office in exchange for rupees or British gold coin, or on the requisition of the Comptroller General for gold bullion. 23. 5. Up to 1910 the following arrangements were in force. Every note was legal tender in its own circle. Payment of dues to the government could be made in the currency notes of any circle, and railway companies could, if they accepted notes of any circle 42 in payment of fares and freight, recover the value of them from the government. But, until recently, no notes were legal tender outside their own circle, and were payable only at the offices of issue of the town from which they were originally issued. Beyond this, the law imposed no obligation to pay. For the accommodation of the public, however, notes of other circles could be cashed at any paper currency office to such extent as the convenience of each office might permit. In ordinary circumstances, every government treasury, of which there are about 250, has cashed or exchanged notes if it could do so without inconvenience. And when this could not be done conveniently for large sums, small sums have generally been exchanged for travelers. 6. It is easy to understand the reasons for these restrictions. India is an enormously large country, over which the conditions of trade lead coins to ebb and flow within each year. At the beginning of the busy season when the autumn crops are harvested, rupees flow in great volume from the presidency towns up country. In early spring they are carried to Burma for the rice crop, and so on, slowly finding their way back again to the presidency towns during the summer. If the government had made its notes encashable at a great variety of centers, it would have been taking on itself the expense and responsibility of carrying out these movements of 43 coin at different seasons of the year. When a country is habituated to the use of notes for making payments, they can be very usefully employed for purposes of remittance also. But a note-issuing authority puts itself in a difficulty if it provides facilities for remittance before a general habit has grown up of using notes for other purposes. If, on the other hand, the notes had been made universal legal tender, but only encashable at presidency towns, there would undoubtedly have been a premium on coin at certain times of the year, and this would have greatly hindered the growth of the note's popularity. The government, therefore, did what it could to make the notes useful and popular for purposes other than those of remittance, and it facilitated remittance so far as the proceeds of taxation, accumulating in its treasuries, permitted it to do this without expense. But it shrank from taking upon itself further responsibility. Its practice may be compared with that of the branches of the Reichsbank. On the other hand, the objections to a policy which divided the country up for the purposes of paper currency are also plain. The limitation of the areas of legal tender and of the offices where the notes were encashable on demand greatly restricted the popularity of the notes. It might well have seemed worthwhile to popularize them, even at the expense of temporary loss. As soon as the public had become 44 satisfied that the notes could be turned into coin readily and without question, their desire to cash them would probably have been greatly diminished. It is not certain that government would have lost in the long run if it had undertaken the responsibility and expense of regulating the flow of coin to the districts where it might be wanted at the different seasons of the year. 7. After the establishment of the gold exchange standard, the importance of enlarging the functions of the note issue became apparent, and since 1900 the question of increasing the availability of the notes has been constantly to the front. In 1900 the government issued a circular asking for opinions on certain proposals, including one for universalising the notes or making them legal tender in all circles. Some authorities thought that notes of small denominations, 5 rupees and 10 rupees, might be safely universalist, without risk on account of the trouble involved, of their being used for remittance on a large scale. It is on these lines that the use of the notes has been developed. In 1903, 5 rupee notes were universalist except in Burma, that is to say, 5 rupee notes of any circle were legal tender and encashable at any office of issue outside Burma, and in 1909 the Burmese limitation was removed. In 1910 a great step forward was taken, and the law on the subject was consolidated by a new act. Notes of 10 rupees and 50 rupees were universalist, and 45 power was taken to universalize notes of higher denominations by executive order. In pursuance of this authority, notes of 100 rupees were universalist in 1911. At the same time, the receipt of notes of the higher denominations in circles other than the circle of issue, in payment of government dues and in payments to railways, post and telegraph offices, was stopped by executive orders. And with a view to minimize any tendency to make use of the new universal notes for remittance purposes, it was decided concurrently with the new act to offer facilities to bankers and merchants to make trade remittances between the currency centers by means of telegraphic orders granted by government at a reduced rate of premium. 24. In the following year, the Comptroller of Paper Currency reported that no difficulty whatever was experienced as the result of universalising the 10 rupees and 50 rupees notes, and the inconveniences, the fear of which had retarded the development of the note system for many years, were not realized. 8. The effect of these successive changes has been to make the old system of circles virtually inoperative. With notes of 100 rupees universal legal tender, it is difficult to see what can prevent the public from using them for purposes of remittance if they should wish to do so. The circles can no longer serve any useful purpose, and it would help to make clear 46 in the public mind the nature of the Indian note issue if they were to be abolished in name as well as in effect. 9. There must have been many occasions under the old system on which ignorant persons suffered inconvenience through having notes of foreign circles passed off on them, and a long time may pass before distrust of the notes, as things not readily convertible, bred out of the memories of these occasions, entirely disappears. But, in combination with other circumstances, the universalising of the notes has had already a striking effect on the volume of their circulation, as is shown in the figures given below. It should be explained that by gross circulation, in the government statistics, is meant the value of all notes that have been issued and not yet paid off, that the net circulation is this sum less the value of notes held by government in its own treasuries, and that the active circulation is the net reduced by the value of notes held by the presidency banks at their head offices. 25. For some purposes, the active circulation is the most important. But it is the reserve of rupees held against the gross circulation which is the best indication of the surplus volume of coined silver available, if necessary, for the purposes of circulation. The following table gives for various years the 47 average of the circulation on the last day of each month. 10. The rules governing the reserves which must be held against currency notes are very simple. A certain fixed maximum, the amount of which is determined from time to time by law, may be held invested, chiefly in Government of India rupee securities. Up to 1890, the invested portion of the reserve amounted to 600 lakhs, Rs. 600,000,000. This was increased to 700 lakhs in 1891, to 800 lakhs in 1892, to 1,000 lakhs in 1897. To 1,200 lakhs, of which 200 lakhs might be in English government securities, in 1905, and to 1,400 lakhs, £9,333,000, of which 400 lakhs, £2,666,000, might be in English securities in 1911. The interest thus accruing on the invested portion of the reserve, less the expenses of the paper currency department, is credited to the general revenues of the government under the head profits of note circulation. This interest now amounts to £300,000 annually. Up to 1898, the whole of the rest was held in silver coin in India. Under the Gold Note Act of 1898, the Government of India obtained authority to hold any part of the metallic portion of the reserve in gold coin. An Act of 1900 gave authority to hold part of this gold in London. But this power was only intended to be used for purposes of temporary convenience, and although some gold was held in London in 1899 and 1900, this was not part of a permanent policy. An Act of 1905, however, gave full power to the government to hold the metallic 49 portion of the reserve, or any part of it, at its free discretion, either in London or in India or partly in both places, and also in gold coin or bullion, or in rupees or silver bullion, subject only to the exception that all coined rupees should be kept in India and not in London. The actual figures, showing where the gold reserve has been held at certain dates, are given below. 11. Gold was originally accumulated in the reserve in India through the automatic working of the rule by which rupees could be obtained in exchange for sovereigns. After exchange touched par in 1898, we see from the above table that gold began to flow in. When in 1900 the accumulations reached £5 million, attempts were made, in accordance with the recommendations of the Fowler Committee, to force it into circulation. 26 After the comparative failure of this attempt, and the passing of the Act of 1905 as described above, the paper currency chest in England was instituted, and by 1906 about 2/3 of the gold which had been accumulated up to that time was transferred to this fund. This stock is kept at the Bank of England, but is not included in the Bank of England's own reserve. Gold which is thus transferred is said to be ear-marked. The fund is under the absolute control of the Secretary of State for India in Council, and transferences to it are, so far as the accounts of the Bank of England are concerned, reckoned as exports. Policy as to how much of the gold should be kept in London and how much in India has fluctuated from time to time. I shall discuss it in Chapter 6. 12. These are the chief relevant facts of law. Important considerations of policy do not lie so plainly on the surface. Since 1899, the circulation of notes has more than doubled, but the invested 51 portion of the reserve has been increased by only 40%. As the note issue has become more firmly established and more widely used, a growing and not a diminishing proportion of the reserves has been kept in liquid form. This is due to a deliberate change of policy, and to the use of the liquid part of the reserve for a new purpose. The bullion reserve is no longer held solely with the object of securing the ability to meet the obligation to cash notes in legal tender, rupees or gold, on demand. It is now utilized for holding gold by means of which the Secretary of State can support exchange in times of depression and maintain at par the gold value of the rupee. For the sake of this object, the government are content to forego the extra profit which might be gained by increasing the investments, and have steadily increased instead, as shown in the table on page 49, the gold portion of the reserve. The paper currency reserve is thus used to provide the gold which is the first line of defense of the currency system as a whole, and hence can hardly be distinguished from the resources of the gold standard reserve proper. It is not profitable to discuss the reserve policy of the paper currency under existing conditions in isolation from the other reserves which the government now hold. The whole problem of the reserves, regarded as a current practical question, is dealt with in Chapter 6. In this chapter one wish to look at the matter from a broad standpoint with 52 an eye to the proper policy in a future possibly remote. 13. The present policy was designed in its main outlines at a time when notes formed an insignificant part of the country's currency, and when the system of circles still greatly restricted their usefulness. The notes were at first and were intended to be little more than silver certificates. The rules governing the reserve were framed, see Section 3, at a time which, to the modern student of currency, is almost prehistoric, under the influence of the Bank of England's system of note issue and of the British Bank Act, an act which had the effect of destroying the importance of notes as a form of currency in England and which it has been found impossible, in spite of some attempts, to imitate in the note, using countries of Europe. As has been urged in Chapter 2, England is in matters of currency the worst possible model for India, for in no country are the conditions so wholly different. A good deal of experience with regard to note issues has now been accumulated elsewhere, which ought some day to prove useful to India if her English rulers can sufficiently free themselves from their English traditions and preconceptions. Let me first give a short account of the nature of the seasonal demand for money in India, and then discuss the salient respects in which her system of note issue differs from those of typical note using countries. 53.14. In contrast to what happens in the case of most note systems, the gross circulation in India diminishes instead of increasing during the busy seasons of autumn and spring. This is due to the fact that the government treasuries, the presidency banks, and possibly other banks and large merchants use the notes as a convenient method of avoiding the custody of large quantities of silver during the slack season when rupees are not wanted. 27. That is to say, they deposit their surplus rupees during the summer in the currency reserve, holding their own reserves in the form of notes, and when the drain of rupees begins up country for moving the crops, these notes have to be cashed. Thus, in the dull season, currency is largely in the hands of a class of persons and institutions which finds it most convenient to hold it in the form of notes, and in the busy season it is dissipated through the country and is, temporarily, in the hands of smaller men, cultivators who have sold their crops, small moneylenders and others, who habitually deal in small sums for which the rupee is the most convenient unit, or who do not yet understand the use of notes and still prefer, therefore, to be paid in actual coin. 15. Notes themselves, however, are used also and to an increasing extent for moving crops, and 54. Although the gross circulation falls during the busy season for the reasons just given, the active circulation, i.e., excluding the holdings of the government treasuries and the presidency banks, does, as we should expect, increase at this time of year. When, therefore, we are considering what proportion of liquid reserves ought to be maintained, or what part the note issue plays in supplying the much-needed element of elasticity in the busy season, it is of the active rather than of the gross circulation that we must take account. The figures are given below in lakhs of rupees. A. An abnormal year. We see, therefore, that, while the notes held by the presidency banks and the treasury fall in the busy season by 700 to 1,000 lakhs below their highest figure in the slack season, the active circulation increases in the busy season over its lowest figure in the slack season by about 400 lakhs, in the latest year for which we have figures, 1911 to 1912, by more than 600 lakhs. Of course, this is not a very high proportion of the total increase in the volume of currency which is required in the busy season. But it is an amount well worth considering, and these figures put the note issue in a more favorable light as a source of currency in the busy season than is usually realized. The relative importance of notes and rupees, 28, in supplying the seasonal needs of trade is well shown in the following table. A. In this table, rupees, but not notes, in the presidency banks are treated as being in circulation. It would be a troublesome piece of work to exclude them, and would make, I think, very little difference to the result. The main variable element in the reserves of the presidency banks is the notes, and these are duly allowed for in the above table. The above table is exceedingly instructive. It shows that the notes supply an increasingly important proportion of the seasonal demand for additional currency. It shows also that the demand for notes from one year to another has been of a steadier character than the demand for rupees. In the period 56 of depression from the winter of 1907 until the autumn of 1908, the active rupee circulation was much harder hit than the active note circulation. For in the 6 months January to June 1908, the rupee circulation fell by 1468 lakhs, while the active note circulation fell by 294 lakhs, and for the 9 months January to September 1908, the former fell by 2186 lakhs, while the latter fell by only 96 lakhs. 29.16. Let me now turn to three salient characteristics, all closely connected with one another, and chiefly distinguishing the Indian system of paper currency from those of most note-using countries. In the first place, the function of note issue is wholly dissociated in India from the function of banking. To discount bills is one of the functions of banks. Where there are central banks with the right of note issue, they are usually able, subject to various restrictions, to increase their note issue at certain seasons of the year in order to discount more bills. In the second place, as there is no central bank in India, there is no government banker. It is true that the government keeps some funds, rather more than £2 million as a rule, at the three presidency banks. But the bulk of their floating resources is held either in London or in cash in their own treasuries in India. Thus, as in the United States, the government maintains an independent treasury system. This 57 means, just as it does in the United States, that at certain seasons of the year when taxes are flowing in fastest, funds may sometimes be withdrawn from the money market. The difficulty and inconvenience to which this system has given rise in the United States are well known to those who are acquainted with the recent financial history of that country. The ill effects of it are to a certain extent counteracted, in the case of India, by a transference of these funds to London and a release of the accumulating currency in India through the sale of council bills. But this is not a perfect solution. The third and most important point arises out of the first two. The Indian currency is internally, i.e., apart from the import of funds from foreign countries, absolutely inelastic. There is no method whatever by which the volume of currency can be temporarily expanded by some credit device within the country to meet the regularly recurrent seasonal demands of trade. Using countries meet the difficulty by increasing the volume of credit created by the banks. Most note-using countries meet it by the central banks discounting a greater volume of home bills than usual, and thus increasing its note circulation temporarily, without a corresponding increase in its metallic reserves. Except for a certain proportion of the business which is transacted by check, chiefly in the presidency towns, there is nothing corresponding to this in India. 58 additional currency, whether notes or rupees, can be obtained in two ways only, by buying council bills in London or by bringing in sovereigns. Additional notes or rupees can be obtained in payment of council bills or in exchange for sovereigns, but not otherwise. The fact that a temporary increase in the media of exchange can only be obtained by bringing in funds from abroad partly explains the high rate of discount in India during the busy season. This question will be more fully dealt with in Chapter 8. But the main point can be put briefly thus. If funds are to be attracted from abroad for a short period, say 3 months, the rate of interest must be high enough to repay the cost of remittance both ways, which in the case of places so remote from one another as India and London is considerable. If there were some authority which could create credit money in India during the busy season, it would not be necessary for the rate of discount to rise so high. 17. The objections to the existing arrangements largely arise, therefore, out of the absence of a state bank. This question is further discussed in chapters 6 and 7. I feel little doubt that India ought to have a state bank, associated in a greater or less degree with the government. The government is drifting year by year into doing more business of an essentially banking character, and as time goes on it will become increasingly objectionable 59 to dissociate some of the functions of modern state banking from others. But there is a considerable weight of opinion in favor of the view that the time for the establishment of a central Indian bank is not yet ripe. In the meantime, is any partial remedy possible for the evils dealt with above? 18. I am inclined to think that such a remedy is possible. The manner in which the reserve against the note issue must be kept is needlessly restricted. Apart from that portion which is permanently invested, the whole must be kept in gold and silver. This is in imitation of the rules governing the Bank of England's note issue. But the note-issuing banks of Europe afford a better model. It might be proper to prescribe by law the holding of a certain proportion of the reserve, say 1/3 30, in gold or silver coin. A further amount might be held, as at present, permanently invested in Government of India securities. With regard to the rest, the government should, I think, permit itself much greater latitude. It should be free to lend it out on suitable security, either in India or London, for periods not exceeding 3 months. In London, it should be lent out on the same conditions as the cash balances and the gold exchange standard, see Chapter 6, are lent out at present. To lend in London would be technically convenient, for the reasons given on 60 page 172, but it would not cure the inelasticity of the Indian system. Part of the reserve should, therefore, be lent out in India. Suitable security for this purpose would be Government of India securities, which would have indirectly the effect of increasing the market for rupee paper, and bills of exchange of the highest class. It is not worthwhile to discuss here in detail the precise methods which it would be proper for the government to adopt in lending out funds in India either from the cash balances or from the paper currency reserve. Whether it were done through the presidency banks only, or whether an approved list of borrowers of government funds were to be drawn up for India as is already the case for London, the effect on the Indian money market would be much the same. The needed element of elasticity would be obtained, and the present absolute dependence of India on London for an expansion of currency would be modified. I shall return to this proposal again in Chapters 6 and 8. Its full force cannot be shown until we have discussed the question of the Secretary of State's reserves as a whole, and have studied in detail the movements of the Indian bank rate. A good deal of opinion has been expressed in India lately in favor of loans being made there from the government's cash balances. Insofar as this opinion demands some new machinery by which on suitable occasions the government can lend out funds in India herself, the evil which it seeks to 61 remedy is a real one, and the method proposed above is, I believe, the right way in which to approach the problem's solution. 19. The discussion of this question will be concluded in Chapters 6, 7, and 8. But it will be well to say a few words at once with a view to avoiding misunderstandings on 2 points. It has been necessary in the immediate past to use the paper currency reserve as a part of the general reserves held for ensuring the absolute stability of the rupee. I do not advocate the lending out in India of any part of this reserve, or of the cash balances, at the expense of the stability of the gold standard, or until adequate measures can be taken in other ways to ensure this. But I think the time has practically arrived when the whole of the liquid portion of the paper currency reserve is not required, in addition to the gold standard reserve proper, for this purpose. A busy season will soon come when the government might lend some part of its reserves in India without endangering in the least the stability of its system and to the great advantage of Indian trade. It ought, at least, to have the power to do this. 53.14. In contrast to what happens in the case of most note systems, the gross circulation in India diminishes instead of increasing during the busy seasons of autumn and spring. This is due to the fact that the government treasuries, the presidency banks, and possibly other banks and large merchants use the notes as a convenient method of avoiding the custody of large quantities of silver during the slack season when rupees are not wanted. 27. That is to say, they deposit their surplus rupees during the summer in the currency reserve, holding their own reserves in the form of notes, and when the drain of rupees begins up country for moving the crops, these notes have to be cashed. Thus, in the dull season, currency is largely in the hands of a class of persons and institutions which finds it most convenient to hold it in the form of notes, and in the busy season it is dissipated through the country and is, temporarily, in the hands of smaller men, cultivators who have sold their crops, small moneylenders and others, who habitually deal in small sums for which the rupee is the most convenient unit, or who do not yet understand the use of notes and still prefer, therefore, to be paid in actual coin. 15. Notes themselves, however, are used also and to an increasing extent for moving crops, and 54. Although the gross circulation falls during the busy season for the reasons just given, the active circulation, i.e., excluding the holdings of the government treasuries and the presidency banks, does, as we should expect, increase at this time of year. When, therefore, we are considering what proportion of liquid reserves ought to be maintained, or what part the note issue plays in supplying the much-needed element of elasticity in the busy season, it is of the active rather than of the gross circulation that we must take account. The figures are given below in lakhs of rupees. A. An abnormal year. We see, therefore, that, while the notes held by the presidency banks and the treasury fall in the busy season by 700 to 1,000 lakhs below their highest figure in the slack season, the active circulation increases in the busy season over its lowest figure in the slack season by about 400 lakhs, in the latest year for which we have figures, 1911 to 1912, by more than 600 lakhs. Of course, this is not a very high proportion of the total increase in the volume of currency which is required in the busy season. But it is an amount well worth considering, and these figures put the note issue in a more favorable light as a source of currency in the busy season than is usually realized. The relative importance of notes and rupees, 28, in supplying the seasonal needs of trade is well shown in the following table. A. In this table, rupees, but not notes, in the presidency banks are treated as being in circulation. It would be a troublesome piece of work to exclude them, and would make, I think, very little difference to the result. The main variable element in the reserves of the presidency banks is the notes, and these are duly allowed for in the above table. The above table is exceedingly instructive. It shows that the notes supply an increasingly important proportion of the seasonal demand for additional currency. It shows also that the demand for notes from one year to another has been of a steadier character than the demand for rupees. In the period 56 of depression from the winter of 1907 until the autumn of 1908, the active rupee circulation was much harder hit than the active note circulation. For in the 6 months January to June 1908, the rupee circulation fell by 1468 lakhs, while the active note circulation fell by 294 lakhs, and for the 9 months January to September 1908, the former fell by 2186 lakhs, while the latter fell by only 96 lakhs. 29.16. Let me now turn to three salient characteristics, all closely connected with one another, and chiefly distinguishing the Indian system of paper currency from those of most note-using countries. In the first place, the function of note issue is wholly dissociated in India from the function of banking. To discount bills is one of the functions of banks. Where there are central banks with the right of note issue, they are usually able, subject to various restrictions, to increase their note issue at certain seasons of the year in order to discount more bills. In the second place, as there is no central bank in India, there is no government banker. It is true that the government keeps some funds, rather more than £2 million as a rule, at the three presidency banks. But the bulk of their floating resources is held either in London or in cash in their own treasuries in India. Thus, as in the United States, the government maintains an independent treasury system. This 57 means, just as it does in the United States, that, at certain seasons of the year when taxes are flowing in fastest, funds may sometimes be withdrawn from the money market. The difficulty and inconvenience to which this system has given rise in the United States are well known to those who are acquainted with the recent financial history of that country. The ill effects of it are to a certain extent counteracted, in the case of India, by a transference of these funds to London and a release of the accumulating currency in India through the sale of council bills. But this is not a perfect solution. 20. The remaining point is this. A provision of the above kind for introducing some degree of elasticity into the Indian currency system would not be very useful in a season such as that of the autumn and winter of 1905-6 or of the autumn of 1912-13, when there was a demand for rupees on so great a scale 62, that it could only be met from the mint. Additions to the currency of this kind can only be made by importing funds from abroad. But these are permanent, not temporary additions. Every such addition makes a similar demand for new coinage in succeeding seasons less likely. They are abnormal, and recent history seems to show that these permanent additions to the Indian currency are not made by slow and steady accretions year by year, but in great bursts of activity at considerable intervals. In years of normal activity, therefore, there may be considerable stores of rupees lying idle in the reserves beyond what is required for the safety of the currency. Indian bankers and merchants can only get at these rupees, so as to obtain a net addition to the currency, by buying sovereigns or council bills in London. If the use for the additional currency is only temporary, the cost of transport or remittance is great enough to make it not worth their while to get this addition until the Indian rate of discount has been forced up to a high level. If the government were free on such occasions to lend out some part of the rupees against higher class security at 5 or even 6%, this would be profitable to the government and would prevent the discount rate from reaching a level which is caused, not by anxiety, but merely by the expense arising out of the distance between London and Calcutta. Chapter 4. The present position of gold in India and proposals for a gold currency. 1. The Fowler Committee of 1898 avowed themselves in favor of the ultimate establishment of a gold currency in India as well as a gold standard. Paragraph 54 of their report runs as follows. We are in favor of making the British sovereign a legal tender and a current coin in India. We also consider that, at the same time, the Indian mints should be thrown open to the unrestricted coinage of gold on terms and conditions such as govern the 3 Australian branches of the Royal Mint. The result would be that, under identical conditions, the sovereign would be coined and would circulate both at home and in India. Looking forward as we do to the effective establishment in India of a gold standard and currency based on the principles of the free in-flow and outflow of gold, we recommend these measures for adoption. The first part of their proposal was carried out immediately, and, in 1899, British gold was declared legal tender at the rate of a sovereign to 15 rupees. It appeared at first as if their further object of a gold currency might soon be attained also. The Principle 64 of minting gold in India was accepted both by the Secretary of State and by the Viceroy's Council, and in 1900 Sir Clinton Dawkins actually announced that it had been decided to constitute a branch of the mint at Bombay for this purpose. In the meantime, an attempt was made, described in Section 4, to force sovereigns into circulation. But the attempt failed, and Sir Clinton Dawkins's proposal was never carried out. As Sir G. Fleetwood Wilson explained in the Legislative Council in 1911, a number of technical and other difficulties were raised by the Royal Mint, which ultimately wore out the patience of Lord Curzon's government. In the interval, the Kohler Gold Mining Companies had mostly entered into agreements for the sale of their produce in England, and the prospect of their bringing their gold to be refined and coined at Bombay, which was to be the piece de resistance of our gold mint, was thus deferred. In the circumstances, it was decided in 1902 to drop the project, and to wait until a stronger demand for a local gold coinage should arise. This account of the matter, however, scarcely does justice to the part played by the British Treasury in defeating the project. The official correspondence lately published, 31, shows that for 2 years, from 1899 to 1901, they made, as Sir G. F. Wilson states, a succession of technical difficulties in a spirit of scarcely veiled hostility to the whole proposal. But eventually, in May 1901, a scheme was arranged, acceptable both to the mint at home and to the 65 authorities in India. At this point in the negotiations, the natural instincts of the Treasury officials became uncontrollable, and respect for the independence of the India Office had to be abandoned. Their first line of defense, in the form of technical difficulties having been overcome, they fell back upon open argument as to the wisdom from the Indian point of view of the whole project. While expressing their satisfaction that an agreement has now been reached, my lords think it desirable, before practical steps are taken to carry out the scheme, to invite Lord George Hamilton to review the arguments originally advanced in favor of the coinage of the sovereign in India, and to consider whether the course of events, in the 2 years which have elapsed since the proposal was made, has not tended to diminish their force, and to render such advantages as are likely to accrue from the establishment of a branch mint wholly incommensurate with the expense to be incurred. The gold standard is now firmly established, and the public requires no proof of the intention of the Indian government not to go back on their policy, which is beyond controversy. sovereigns are readily attracted to India when required under existing conditions. On the other hand, the estimates of the Government of India of gold available for coinage in that country are less than was anticipated, nor is any considerable increase expected, at any rate for some time. The staff would have to be maintained in idleness for a large part of the year at considerable cost to the Indian exchequer. It is of course for Lord George Hamilton to decide whether, in spite of these objections, the scheme is to be proceeded with. The India Office answered thus, frowny face 66. The establishment of a mint for the coinage of gold in India is the clearest outward sign that can be given of the consummation of the new currency system, and to abandon the proposal now must attract attention and provoke criticism and unrest. His Lordship is not inclined to abandon the scheme at the stage which it has now reached. The Treasury's reply was cogent. My Lords cannot believe that the position of the gold standard in India will be strengthened, or public confidence in the intentions of the government confirmed, by providing machinery for obtaining gold coins which is neither demanded nor required by the mercantile community, while, on the other hand, the failure or only partial success of a gold mint would undoubtedly be pointed to by the opponents of the gold standard policy, although without justification, as evidence of the breakdown of that policy. The Treasury's arguments were, as they deserved to be, successful. After consultation with the Government of India, who drew attention to the agreements referred to by Sir G. F. Wilson above, entered into by the mining companies, the Secretary of State agreed February 6, 1903, to the project's indefinite postponement. No public explanation was given in India of this sudden recession from what has hitherto been regarded as an essential feature of the currency policy inaugurated in 1893 and definitely established on the recommendations of the Currency Committee of 1898. 32. 2. From 1903 up to 1910 little was heard of proposals 67 for an active encouragement of the circulation of gold. But the intention had never been repudiated, and in the budget debate of 1910 Sir James Meston, then Financial Secretary to the Government, spoke as follows. The broad lines of our action and our objects are clear and unmistakable, and there has been no great or fundamental sacrifice of consistency in progress towards our ideal, since the Fowler Commission that progress has been real and unbroken. There is still one great step forward before the ideal can be reached. We have linked India with the gold countries of the world. We have reached a gold exchange standard, which we are steadily developing and improving. The next and final step is a true gold currency. That, I have every hope, will come in time, but we cannot force it. The backwardness of our banking arrangements, the habits and suspicions of the people, the infancy of co-operation, all stand in the way. But the final step will come when the country is ripe for it. I trust that will not long be delayed. For when it comes, it will obliterate all the mistakes, all the inconveniences, all the artificialities of our present position. In March 1911 matters were carried a step further, Sir Guy Fleetwood Wilson replying in the Legislative Council to Sir Vitaldus Thackeray, who had argued that a 10-rupee gold coin ought to be minted and put into active circulation in India, that much has happened since 1902 which justifies the reopening of the question. In a dispatch to the Secretary of State, dated May 16, 1912, the Government of India proposed to open the Bombay Mint to the coinage of 68 sovereigns. This is an exceedingly confused document. It is mainly directed to showing that an increased use of gold as currency in India would be advantageous to the system. But, apart from the validity of this argument, it is not clearly shown in what way the establishment of a mint would affect the desired purpose. Indeed, it is explicitly admitted that, in proposing to open a gold mint, it is not our intention to induce thereby an increased flow of gold to India. Indeed, were that our purpose, we recognize that it would certainly fail. The dispatch reads as though it were an attempt to reconcile divergent and contradictory views which had received expression. The British Treasury, however, has again come to the rescue. They have stipulated either that the branch mint should be under imperial management, which would be inconvenient, or that it should be wholly separate, which would be expensive. Accordingly, in a dispatch dated October 18, 1912, the Secretary of State suggested to the Government of India that instead of sovereigns, Indian gold coins of the denomination of, say, 10 rupees should be coined at Bombay. The Government of India have replied that they prefer this proposal to the conditions demanded by the Treasury, and that they contemplate making inquiries as to Indian opinion on it. This is how the matter stands at present. The actual policy of the Government of India since 1900 as regards gold currency has been, in my opinion, 69 well judged. But these negotiations show that the authorities are still doubtful as to the advantages of the existing system. 3. Up to 1870, the English currency system was the envy of the rest of the world, and it was supposed that the excellencies of the practical working of this system were due to the fact that the actual circulating medium of the country was gold. This, it was thought, must be the only really safe way of maintaining absolute stability. Germany, accordingly, when she instituted her gold standard, prohibited the issue of notes of a less denomination than 100 marks, in order that gold might actually circulate from hand to a maximum possible amount. For similar reasons, the business community showed themselves immovably hostile to Lord Goskin's proposals for the issue of £1 notes in England, while other countries who have, with few exceptions, found the expense of a gold medium of exchange prohibitively heavy, have nevertheless envied those who could afford it, and have adapted their laws, even when they could not afford to adapt their practice, to a currency of gold. But in recent years the evolution of currency has, for reasons which I have elaborated in Chapter 2, embarked upon a new stage of development, and all this has changed. In England, the use of a check currency has grown so universal that the composition of the metallic coin has become a matter of secondary importance. In Germany, the policy of 1876 has been deliberately reversed by a recent revision of the Bank Act, and 20-mark notes are now issued with the deliberate object of keeping as much gold as possible in the bank and wasting as little as possible in circulation. This new policy is likely to be extended in the future. The president of the Reichsbank, addressing the Budget Committee of the Reichstag in January 1913, argued that the rule laid down in 1906, forbidding the free issue of 20 and 50-mark notes to an amount exceeding £15 million, would have to be repealed, the issue of these notes in 1912 having exceeded the limit by £11,500,000, and he went on to say that they must, in the interests of sound policy, increase the issue of notes and thus hold a larger quantity of gold in their reserves. In other countries, where actual currency is the principal medium of exchange, the attempt to introduce gold as the medium passing from hand to hand has been for the most part abandoned. A great part of the new gold has flowed, during the last 10 years, into the reserves of the state banks, and a comparatively small amount only can have found its way into circulation. In Austria-Hungary, for example, after the currency reform of 1892, attempts were made to force gold into circulation just as they were in India. They luckily failed. The authorities of the Austro-Hungarian Bank now keep 71. All the gold they can in their central reserves, and they are not likely to make another attempt to dissipate it. The same kind of thing occurred in Russia. After establishing with difficulty a gold standard, they began with the theory, and have since abandoned it, that a gold currency was the natural corollary. Other examples could be given. A gold standard is the rule now in all parts of the world, but a gold currency is the exception. The sound currency maxims of 20 or 30 years ago are still often repeated, but they have not been successful, nor ought they to have been, in actually influencing affairs. I think I am right in saying that Egypt is now the only country in the world in which actual gold coins are the principal medium of exchange. 33. The reasons for this change are easily seen. It has been found that the expense of a gold circulation is insupportable, and that large economies can be safely effected by the use of some cheaper substitute. And it has been found further that gold in the pockets of the people is not in the least available at a time of crisis or to meet a foreign drain. For these purposes, the gold resources of a country must be centralized. 72. This view has long been maintained by economists. 34. Ricardo's proposals for a sound and economical currency were based on the principle of keeping gold out of actual circulation. Mill, Political Economy, Book 3, Chapter 22, Section 2, argued that gold wanted for exportation is almost invariably drawn from the reserves of banks, and is never likely to be taken from the outside circulation while the banks remain solvent. While Gaskin spoke as follows in 1891 before the London Chamber of Commerce, "We only have as an effective circulation that which is required for the daily wants of the people. You cannot tap that to any extent so as to increase your central stock of gold. You may raise your rate of interest to 6% or 8%, but the bulk of the people will not carry less gold in their pockets than they did before, and I doubt whether, from other quarters, you would be able to get much addition to your central store. But while it is no new theory that gold in the pockets of the people is absolutely useless for the purposes for which a currency reserve is held, all but the highest authorities have believed until fairly recently that no gold standard can be really stable unless gold actually circulates in the country. The contrary view was distrusted by practical financiers, and only of late years has it become powerful enough to dictate policies. At last, however, governments have been converted to it, and it is now as much 73 their anxiety to keep gold out of circulation and in their reserves as it was formerly the opposite. A preference for a tangible gold currency is no longer more than a relic of a time when governments were less trustworthy in these matters than they are now, and when it was the fashion to imitate uncritically the system which had been established in England and had seemed to work so well during the second quarter of the 19th century. 4. Let us now apply these general considerations to the case of India. In 1900, an attempt was seriously made to get sovereigns into active circulation, in accordance with the recommendations of the Committee of 1898. It was decided to pay out gold to the public as soon as the stock should exceed 5 million sterling, and such payments commenced on January 12, 1900, at the currency offices in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. The instructions issued were to tender gold to all presenters of notes, but to give rupees if they were preferred. Later on, the Comptroller General was authorized to send sovereigns to the larger district treasuries. And in March, the post offices in the presidency towns began to give gold in payment of money orders, and the presidency banks were requested to issue sovereigns in making payments on government account. These arrangements continued in force throughout the financial year 1900 to 1901, and by March 31, 1901, the amount put into the hands of the public 74 reached the considerable total of £6,750,000. But of this amount, part was exported, not far short of half was returned to government, and it was supposed that the greater part of the remainder went into the hands of bullion dealers. 35 further attempts to force gold into circulation were, therefore, abandoned, and a large part of the gold which had accumulated in the currency reserve in India was, a little later on, shipped to England in order to be held ear-marked at the Bank of England. Since that time, the provisions of the Indian system regarding gold, as already given in Chapter 1, have been as follows. 1. The sovereign is legal tender in India at 15 rupees to £1. 2. The government has bound itself by notification to give rupees for sovereigns at this rate. 3. It is willing, as a rule, to give sovereigns for rupees at this rate, but is under no legal obligation to do so, and will not always exchange large quantities. 5. The defeat of the experiment of 1900 to 1901 was due to a variety of causes, but mainly, I should suppose, to the long habituation of the Indian public to the use of silver, and to the unsuitability of the sovereign by reason of its high value for so poor a country as India. But it is not by any means so certain that an attempt at the present time to put a 10-rupee gold 75 coin into circulation would not meet with more success. Its value would be somewhat less. But, more important than this, the taste of India for gold, as against silver, has been very considerably developed during the last 10 years. It will be worthwhile to summarize the available evidence as to the present position of gold in India. 6. We know, of course, what the annual net addition to the total stock of gold in India, i.e. the imports and the production less the exports, approximately is, although the amount of the steady leakage across the land frontiers is usually neglected. 36. We know also how much of this addition is in the form of sovereigns and how much in the form of gold bars. By making allowance, therefore, for the increase or decrease of sovereigns in the paper currency reserve and the government treasuries, we can calculate how many sovereigns have found their way each year into the hands of the public. But as to the uses to which the public put the sovereigns, our information is exceedingly vague and unprecise. By far the most careful and valuable discussions of the question are to be found in the reports of the Comptroller General of 76 paper currency for 1910-11, written by Mr. R. W. Gillen, and for 1911-12, written by Mr. M. F. Gauntlet, and I have made free use of these in what follows. First, it will be useful to have before us the statistical information referred to above. 7. The enormous amount of wealth which the Indian people are now devoting to the barren accumulation of gold is brought out very strikingly by the figures in the third column. We know that it is hoarded, used as jewelry, as gilding, even, according to Messrs. Samuel Montague, as medicine. But these figures are not relevant to our present purpose, and we must turn to the figures in the last column, giving the flow of sovereigns into the hands of the public. What part of this total is employed for ornament? 77. What part for hoarding, what part is melted down, and what part is left truly to serve as currency? In the first place, it is estimated that about £1 million shield sovereigns are now imported annually. These are sought after for purposes of ornament and stand at a premium. 37. It may be safely assumed, therefore, that they are not used as currency. Further, it is certain that a large number are melted every year and used as bullion. There are two causes of this. As regards melting, writes Mr. Gillen, 38. It is to be noted that for certain purposes the sovereign has at all times an advantage. Gold being sold in 5 and 10-ounce bars, if a jeweler wants only a small quantity, a full-weight sovereign meets his purpose very well, as he knows its exact weight, fineness, and value, and has no trouble in obtaining it. And the sovereign is presumably cheaper than the same quantity of gold in out-of-the-way parts. There is also another cause, connected with the exchanges. Wink with a frown. 39. At some times of year, the cheapest way of getting gold is to buy sovereigns for rupees from the government. This explanation is borne out by the fact that there is a steady demand for sovereigns from the government's reserves during the summer months. This is the time when the exchanges make it most advantageous to get gold in this way, and when there is least likely to be a demand for sovereigns as a 78 medium of exchange. Many sovereigns, therefore, are melted, but we should be making rather a random guess if we were to attempt to say how many. There must still remain, as the result of recent importations, a large number of sovereigns retained in the hands of the public in that form. But we cannot assume that even this reduced total is truly employed as a medium of exchange. There is a good deal of evidence for supposing that in some parts of the country sovereigns are displacing rupees for the purpose of hoards. This may be the case even when in the first instance the gold is used for currency. The crops may be sold for gold because the cultivator wants gold for his hoard. It is quite conceivable, Mr. Gillen points out, that the acceptance by the cultivator of gold in payment of his crops is in the nature of barter, that is to say, he takes the gold not as coin merely but for some other purpose, and the return of gold in payment of revenue may be no more than the return of so much as he finds himself unable to retain. 8. It is clear, then, that we must not fly from a glance at column 1 of the table on page 76, or even from a glance at column 5, to extravagant conclusions as to the present position of the sovereign in the Indian currency system. Many heavy deductions must be made from the first totals. What direct evidence is there as to the use of gold as currency? The best indication, to quote Mr. Gillen again, 79, of the extent to which sovereigns have established themselves as a regular part of the currency is to be found in the figures of receipts at post offices and railways. These have been as follows. It has been estimated by the Paper Currency Department 40 that in 1907, as a result of the absorption of earlier years, not less than 2 millions were in circulation. But it is supposed that by the end of 1908 nearly the whole of that amount had disappeared. Owing to the depression of that year and the low level of the exchanges, the most profitable employment of the sovereigns was as bullion. This is strikingly borne out by the almost negligible receipts of gold, given below, by post offices and railways in 1909 to 10. Until 1910, the absorption of sovereigns was not sufficient to restore them to a position of any importance as currency. We have chiefly to consider, therefore, the imports of sovereigns since 1910. It is from this source that the sovereigns now circulating as currency are likely to have come. 89. When we proceed to detail, it appears that there are several important parts of India in which the use of the sovereign is still negligible. In Bengal, Eastern Bengal, Assam, the central provinces, and Burma. In these provinces it has not begun to make any serious headway. In the United Provinces, for the purchase of wheat, and in certain districts of Madras, on the other hand, sovereigns seem to circulate to some extent, to be received freely by the general public, and to be increasing, though at no sensational rate. In Bombay and the Punjab, particularly in the latter, their use is, however, much more important. Most of the detailed evidence, which is available, refers to the Punjab, and care must be taken not to apply to the whole of India opinions from witnesses in that province as to the present position of gold. The following extract from a resolution passed by the Punjab Chamber of Commerce on June 4, 1912, is interesting. The Chamber are able to state authoritatively that sovereigns are becoming popular and that their circulation is increasing. They are accepted as legal tender in the bazaars, and this may be attributed to the intelligence of the people and to the fact that all over the East, in China and the Strait settlements, where the Punjab sepoys serve in the army and the police, the sovereign is popular. These men remit their earnings in gold, and as there is hardly a village in the Punjab that has not sent a man to these services, it is not surprising 81. That the value of the sovereign is understood. It is difficult to say to what extent sovereigns are being hoarded, but that they are held up by the well-to due to a very considerable amount is undoubtedly the case, and hoarding will continue among the rural population for years to come. With regard to the probable effect this importation of sovereigns may have on exchange, they are of opinion that government should not rely on the sovereigns that are being absorbed by the districts in exchange for produce, and in the shape of savings coming out at any time in any appreciable quantity to support the stability of the rupee. In 1911-12, the Comptroller of Currency collected a number of district reports as to the growing popularity of gold in the Punjab. They completely corroborate the above summary. 10. Before we pass on to other aspects of the question, a word may be added with special reference to the very large gold imports of quite recent date, i.e. in 1912. Popular attention has been attracted by the figures for that year, which are indeed truly remarkable. 41. The gold imports of 1911-12 and 1912-13, see table on page 76, were noteworthy as compared with those of former years by reason of their huge aggregate amount, but they were even more noteworthy if regard be had to the very high proportion of sovereigns. 82. I do not believe, however, that a conclusion can fairly be drawn from these figures as to any startling change in the position of the sovereign in India has experienced 2 very good seasons and has been able, therefore, to accumulate savings unusually large extent for investment in gold ornaments and hoards. Is this altogether inadequate a partial explanation of the recorded figures? I do not, for the following reasons, think it is. In the first place, the gold imports for 1911-12 fall short of, and those for 1912-13 do not much exceed, those for 1910-11 if we exclude the additions to the paper currency reserve. Imports of gold for this purpose are, for reasons to be explained in Chapter 5, quite independent of the effective desire of India for gold, and occur merely because gold happens in some circumstances to be a cheaper means of remittance to India than council bills or any other method. In the second place, the conditions of 1912 were somewhat abnormal on account of the unusually large supplies of gold which were available from Australia and Egypt. It is a matter of importing gold from England, those who want it for bullion purposes will generally find it cheaper to buy gold bars than to buy gold coin. But if there are sovereigns on their way from Australia and ready to be diverted to India, or if there are surplus sovereigns available for export at Alexandria, it may be a good deal cheaper to buy these sovereign 83 than to get gold bars from London. The explanation of this, depending on the foreign exchanges, is fully discussed in Chapter 5. I suspect, therefore, that a higher proportion than usual of the sovereigns imported in 1912 were put to non-currency uses for which gold bars would have served just as well. If sovereigns rather than bars are imported from London, it is reasonable to draw the conclusion that the importer, since he must pay a higher price, definitely prefers them. But if sovereigns are imported from Egypt or Australia rather than bars from London, no such conclusion can be drawn. Of the 21,500,000 pound sovereigns imported into India in 1912, only about 5 million pounds came from London, the rest from Egypt and Australia. 42 from the gross figures of gold imports into India in 1912, even heavier deductions than usual must be made, therefore, before we have an indication of the extent to which additional sovereigns have really found their way into the currency. 43, 84. 11. Perhaps we may fairly sum this evidence up by saying that it goes to show the existence in India at the present time of an enormous demand for gold bullion, a very considerable demand for sovereigns for purposes of hoarding, and a relatively smaller demand for them, chiefly confined to the United Provinces, the Punjab, Madras, and Bombay, for purposes of currency. Those who think that this tendency to use gold coins should be further encouraged have advocated 3 methods of doing so: by making arrangements for the coinage of sovereigns at Bombay, by the mintage there of some distinctively Indian coin of the denomination of 10 rupees, by a deliberate attempt on the part of government, as in 1900 to 1901, to force sovereigns into circulation and to familiarize parts of the country with them where they are at present unfamiliar, even to the extent of refusing to issue more rupees on demand. 12. I have placed these proposals in the order of their probable efficacy to effect their purpose. I see no reason why the first, the coinage of sovereigns at Bombay, should have any effect at all towards increasing the use of sovereigns as currency. For types of occasion can be distinguished on which gold bars might be presented at Bombay for coinage. A gold might be deliberately imported from England for the purpose, or it might occasionally happen that importers of gold bars, having temporarily 85 miscalculated the demand for bars, would wish to sell these bars to the government. B. Owners of Indian gold mines might conceivably find it worth their while to suspend the arrangements they have made in recent years with English refiners and might sell their gold, about 2 million pounds annually, to the Bombay Mint. Whether or not they would find it worthwhile to do this would presumably depend on the facilities for refining in India and the terms offered by the Bombay Mint. C. The habits of the people might be changing, the importation of new bars from England ceasing, and the people wishing to get rid of the bars and ornaments they already had. D. In times of famine or depression, the people might sell their bars and ornaments to the mint when they were driven to turn their ultimate resources into money. Provided the Bombay Mint did not offer to coin on more favorable terms than the British Mint, which presumably it would not do, it seems exceedingly unlikely that bar gold would be imported from England on purpose to be coined in India rather than in England. But if this were to happen, it would have no consequences worth thinking about. The place of mintage is a matter of indifference. In all the other eventualities suggested above, the gold is brought to the mint, not to satisfy a demand for new gold currency, but because the owners of the 86 gold wish to sell it. The sellers would take payment in sovereigns, notes, or rupees, since the former can always be exchanged for the latter, as might suit their convenience. In cases C and D, the government would probably be forced in the end to export the sovereigns it had itself minted, and to bear the cost of export as well as the cost of minting. The chief result of mintage at Bombay, therefore, assuming that the terms for coming were substantially the same as in England, would be a small saving of expense to sellers of gold in India. Importers of gold bars would be saved occasionally a small loss of interest due to miscalculation, Owners of Indian gold mines might conceivably pay, at the expense of government, infinitesimally higher dividends. The people turning their hoards into money would be able to save the expense of sending the gold to England. A corresponding cost would fall on the government for mintage in the first instance and sometimes for export afterwards. These consequences, whether desirable or not, have very little to do with currency questions. The last of them, the making it easier to turn hoards into money, is very likely desirable. But all of them could be brought about more cheaply without the establishment of a Bombay Mint. It would be sufficient if the government were to publish terms on which it was ready to buy gold bars. It might be a real convenience if government notified its readiness to purchase bars 87, tendered in India at 58 rupees annas 5 per ounce, 44. Payable in silver or notes or sterling drafts on London or in sovereigns, on the present system, if they were available. 45. The government would be involved from time to time in the cost of export, but this cost it would have to bear, I believe, just as often if there were a mint, while the cost of the mint itself would be saved. Such a notification, as is suggested above, would be much more in the true spirit of the Indian currency system than the establishment of a gold mint would be, and it would serve the convenience of the public just as efficiently, at less expense to government. The establishment of a mint, however, would flatter at small expense and ignorant vanity. The government, by granting it in response to popular appeal, though I doubt whether, in fact, there is any such appeal, would have a pleasant feeling of being democratic on an occasion when to yield involves no more evil than any other expenditure on a piece of fairly cheap ostentation. 13. To the second proposal for the mintage of a distinctively Indian gold coin, many of the above comments apply equally. But the existence of a 88 10-rupee gold piece 13ths for D might very possibly do something to popularize the use of gold as currency, largely because it would be of a smaller and therefore more convenient denomination. 46. It is very difficult to prophesy with regard to the local popularity of a new coin. On the other hand, apart from the general objections to be dealt with later against popularizing gold, it is generally a bad thing to introduce a new coin and add to the confusion of currencies. For purposes of export, at times of depression, the 10-rupee piece would be worth less than 2/3 of a sovereign. The sovereign, moreover, is fast becoming the international gold coin par excellence far beyond the bounds of the British Empire. In 1911, 43,305,722 British sovereigns were minted, or a good deal more than the whole gold coinage in that year of the rest of the world, viz. 33,375,455 pounds. A rival coin ought not to be set up in India unless some evident advantage is to be obtained from it. 14. The third policy, that of active measures on the part of government to get more gold into circulation, is not likely to be adopted. If it were, it is difficult to say if it would be successful or not. To force a coin on people is not always the best way to popularize it, and if rupees were to be refused, there would probably be a small premium on them, 89, or a small discount on gold, a position which would not help gold. 15. It is probably the case, however, that if it were desirable to popularize the use of gold, a means could be found of effecting this in some degree. The main question is whether this is, in fact, the right policy. Lord Crewe looks forward. See his speech in the House of Lords, November 14, 1912. With some confidence to the increased use of gold currency in India among the people, although it may be a long and indefinite time before it becomes the habitual and favorite coin in the country at large. Ought he to expect this result with satisfaction as well as confidence? My own answer to this question is unhesitatingly in the negative. The principal arguments against such a policy are two. First, the general argument that it is extravagant and wasteful to have gold coins as the actual media of circulation, and second, the argument more especially applicable to India, that it would diminish and not, as its advocates claim for it, increase the stability of the currency system as a whole. 16. Let us consider first how heavy a loss and expense the popularity of a gold currency might involve. During the last 12 years, the government have been able to accumulate a sum of about £21 million from the profits of rupee coinage, and the interest on the invested portion of the paper currency 90 reserve is now about £300,000 annually. Thus, the annual income, derivable from the interest on the sum set free by the use of cheap forms of currency, amounts already to about £1 million. With the rapidly increasing use of notes, this income should show a steady growth in the future. Both these sources of profit would be gravely jeopardized if the introduction of an Indian gold coin were to meet with any considerable measure of success. It would be specially unfortunate if a competitor to the paper currency were to be introduced, before the virtual abolition of the system of circles has had time to have its full effect in the direction of popularizing the use of notes. 17. Advocates of a gold currency, however, would not, I think, deny that it might involve the country in some extra expense. They support their policy on the ground that it would do a great deal to ensure the stability of the currency system, and that it is worthwhile to incur some expense for this object. I think it is possible to show that such a policy is likely on the whole to have an exactly opposite effect. It is suggested that the currency should be composed of rupees, gold, and paper, with rupees still predominating, but consisting of gold in a considerably higher proportion than at present. This greater infusion of gold would necessarily be at the expense either of the currency reserve or of the gold standard reserve. If the gold replaced notes, the former 91 would be diminished, and if it replaced rupees, the latter. It is tacitly assumed that the greater part of what has to be withdrawn from the circulation at a time of crisis would come from the gold portion of the circulation. This assumption seems to me to be unwarranted and contrary to general experience. At a time of crisis, it is the fiduciary coins with which the public are most eager to part. Bankers and others would keep as much of their surplus currency as they possibly could in the form of gold, and it would be rupees, in great part, and not gold that would be paid into the government treasuries. Thus, the infusion of more gold into the circulation would necessarily weaken the existing reserves, and would not correspondingly reduce the amount of such reserves which government ought in prudence to keep. When it became necessary to contract the volume of currency, government would be in a worse position than at present, unless the greater part of what was withdrawn came from the gold portion of the circulation and not from the rupee or paper portion. This is not an expectation upon which it would be prudent to act. I have already quoted the late Lord Goskin's authority in support of the centralization of gold reserves. A further passage from the address he delivered on the same occasion, in proposing a 92 scheme of £1 notes for England, is relevant here. I would much prefer for national and monetary purposes to have £20 million of gold under our command at the Bank of England than 30 million sovereigns in the hands of the public. If the issue of £1 notes took place and were taken up, we should have £20 million more central gold, an immeasurably stronger reserve than 30 million sovereigns on which we could not place our hands. 18. There are, in fact, two ways of maintaining stability in a country whose demand for currency varies widely from year to year. Either it must consist almost wholly of gold, or a sufficient reserve must be concentrated in the hands of government. If only 1/4 or 1/5 of the circulation consists of gold, I do not think that a government can rely on getting more than a fraction of this, when it becomes necessary to contract the circulation by 1/6 or 1/7, whereas if the gold is in the government's reserves, the whole of it is available. For obvious reasons of convenience and of economy, the greater part of the Indian circulation must continue in any case to consist of rupees. It is vain to suppose that the advantages of a true gold currency can be obtained by the compromise of somewhat increasing the gold element. If the government dissipates some part of its sterling resources 93 over the country, and any proposal for a greater infusion of gold into the currency amounts to this, it must plainly stand in a weaker position to meet a crisis than if they are concentrated in its own chests. 19. The encouragement of gold, therefore, would involve expense and, at the same time, diminish safety. There is a further argument against it, connected nevertheless with the above, which is of great importance. If gold were to supplant rupees only and not notes, and were to supplant them to so great an extent that sovereigns would tend to flow out of the currency at times of depression, there might be something to be said for it. It is certainly the case that it is a disadvantageous thing for India to have so large a part of her currency in the form of expensive tokens. The issue of rupees strengthens the reserves by less than a half of their nominal value. The degree of damage to the government's reserves, therefore, would be much less if the gold were to supplant rupees than if it were to supplant notes. But this is most unlikely to be the case. It is for comparatively large payments that the sovereign may gradually come into use, and for these it is essentially a rival to the note. For small payments, which in India make in the aggregate an enormous total, the sovereign can no more supplant the rupee than it can supplant the shilling in England. Reports collected by the Comptroller of Currency 94 in 1911-12 already show in a striking way the tendency of gold to take the place which is, or might be, occupied by notes. The rapidity with which gold is becoming popularized in the Punjab is probably due in very great part to the fact that notes have never become acclimatized there. 47. The inconvenience of making large payments in silver is obvious. Wink with a frown. 48. And facilities for obtaining gold are naturally welcomed. The events of the last 2 or 3 years may have done very great harm in the direction of postponing the development of the use of notes in northern India. In Bengal and eastern Bengal, on the other hand, the slow progress made by gold is to be explained by the fact that the people of these provinces are much more accustomed to the use of notes, which are even used in some cases for the purpose of hoarding. Cf. page 165. If the government were to attempt to further in any way the circulation of gold in the Bengals, they would be aiming a dangerous blow at their own note issue, whereas if notes could be encouraged in place of rupees in the jute trade, there would be a huge increase in their circulation. It is also reported that the use of gold in the rice trade in Burma would displace notes. 95 mainly. The following quotations from the reports, collected in 1911-12 by the Comptroller of Currency from districts in the Punjab, referred to above, illustrate the point that gold is preferred to silver because it is more convenient to carry, and that notes are distrusted because there is no universally spread assurance of their ready convertibility. 49. Gujranwala. The zamindar prefers to have his price for the grain in gold, as he can easily carry it and easily exchange it and, if necessary, easily put it away. He shies at currency notes of any value, as they cannot be easily exchanged, and to receive payment in silver means cost of carriage and a greater risk of being robbed. Contractors of the canal department are very glad to receive payment of their checks in gold. Some have remarked that sovereigns can be exchanged even in the village most remote from civilization, but notes, even of the value of 5 rupees, are looked upon with distrust by the village yokel and even by the village sahukar. With a sovereign there is no trouble, no awkward questions are asked and no discount taken. Jang. The people prefer gold because it is less troublesome than silver money. Gurdaspur. The facility of transit is the reason why corn merchants prefer sovereigns to silver. Ambala. Both in cities and villages, sovereigns are replacing notes more than rupees. Banu. Gold is slowly but steadily replacing currency notes. Rohtak. With the increase of gold, a corresponding decrease in the use of currency notes has been observed during 1911-12. 96. Ludhiana. With the increase of gold, the issues of notes have correspondingly decreased. These particular statements are corroborated by general statistics. The most recent statistics of the use of 10 rupee notes in the Punjab and in Bombay, as compared with Bengal, strongly suggest that the recent development of gold circulation in these provinces has been at the expense of these notes. In the Punjab it is reported, in 1911-12, that large payments for agricultural produce are never made in notes, and that gold is replacing notes to some extent even in ordinary payments among merchants and traders. In the light of these facts, it is a wonderful tribute to the enduring power of the sound currency maxims of the middle of last century that responsible officials should have welcomed the outflow of gold as the salvation of their system. Before leaving this topic, I wish to emphasize, in close connection with it, a special reason why it is so important to develop the use of notes in India at the present time. It is desirable to encourage the popularity of the note issue, and to avoid encouraging its rivals, not only for reasons of immediate economy or because, by the centralization of the reserves, the stability of the currency is increased, but also because, in a country where checks are not likely for many years to come to be used to a dominating extent, it is only thus that a 97 proper degree of seasonal elasticity in the currency can possibly be secured. This question has been already raised in Chapter 3, and I shall return to it again in Chapters 6 and 7. 20. One minor indirect consequence of the existing system is worth reference. Gold flows into the currency reserve when this is a cheaper way of getting notes or rupees than by buying council bills or transfers. See Chapter 5. It flows out of the currency reserve when sovereigns are wanted for circulation or for hoarding, or when this is the cheapest way in which bullion dealers can get gold. There is reason for thinking that a good deal flows out for the last reason, and it is the occasion of this outflow which I wish to examine in a little more detail. The Currency Department publishes figures which show the number of sovereigns withdrawn from the treasuries each month. It appears from these that, while some are withdrawn in the winter months during the busy season, when the demand for currency and for hoarding, since it is then that the cultivators sell their crops and realize their savings in coin, is at its height, there is in the summer also, when it is most improbable that an extra supply is required for these purposes, a steady and, in the aggregate, a heavy drain. A brief arithmetical calculation provides what must, I think, be the explanation of this. Since the price of bullion in London is, normally, £3:17:9 per ounce, while the price of 98 sovereigns is £3:17:10 1/2, the bullion import point of Indian exchange will be a little below the sovereign import point. Thus, when exchange is fairly high, an Indian purchaser of gold finds it more profitable to buy drafts on London, purchase gold in the bullion market and ship it to India, than to purchase sovereigns from the treasury at once. For d. But when exchange is low, the reverse is the case, and it is cheaper to get as much gold as the treasury will let you have at once. For d. I do not know exactly where the dividing line comes wink with a frown 50, but when telegraphic transfers are at once. For 1/8 d. It is certainly more profitable to get gold bullion in London, and when they are at once. For 1/32 d. It may pay to get it in India. These considerations are modified in practice by the fact that many Indian purchasers of bullion have a preference for small gold bars which are manufactured in England. Thus these bars are worth more than an equivalent weight of sovereigns, and consequently importation of bullion in this form takes place throughout the year. But for many non-currency purposes sovereigns are as good or nearly as good as other forms of bullion, and for these purposes the Indian treasury is the bullion dealer's cheapest source of supply when exchange is relatively low. Thus in the summer months the bullion dealers will always draw their supplies from the treasury, so long as the treasury is willing to 99 supply them. Whenever, therefore, gold in India is available to the public throughout the year, the government will lose during the summer months whatever amount the bullion dealers require. On every sovereign thus drawn out, the government loses about 1/1/2 d. For the gold could have been kept in England by selling bills at a rate more advantageous than the par of exchange by about this amount. The annual amount which is drawn out by bullion dealers when gold is available all the year round is probably not less than £2 million. Thus, an important indirect effect of the present practice is to allow bullion dealers in the summer months to get their gold at the government's cost slightly cheaper than they otherwise could. 21. India, as we all know, already wastes far too high a proportion of her resources in the needless accumulation of the precious metals. The government ought not to encourage in the slightest degree this ingrained fondness for handling hard gold. By the elimination of both precious metals, to the utmost extent that public opinion will permit, from amongst the hoards and the circulation of the country, they ought to counteract an uncivilized and wasteful habit. It is interesting to reflect that India's love of the precious metals, ruinous though it has been to her own economic development, has flourished in the past to the great advantage of Western nations. Everyone knows Jevons's description of India as 100, the sink of the precious metals, always ready to absorb the redundant bullion of the West and to save Europe from the more violent disturbances to her price level. In very recent years, while the South African mines have been reaching the zenith of their production, she has been fulfilling to perfection her role of sink. Prices have been rising, as it is, much faster than is healthy and in a way very disadvantageous to such a creditor nation as Great Britain, to whom large sums fixed in terms of gold are annually due. It is reasonable to think that without the assistance of the Indian demand, they would have risen still faster. From its very short period point of view, the city is sometimes cross when this Indian demand shows itself in an inconvenient week. But if we take a longer view, the Indian demand is, at a time of plentiful gold supply like the present, a true friend to the city and an enemy of inflation. On the other hand, if a time comes when Indians learn to leave off their unfertile habits and to divert their hordes into the channels of productive industry and to the enrichment of their fields, they will have the money markets of the world at their mercy. A surfeit of gold can do at least as much damage as a shortage. During the past 60 years, India is supposed to have absorbed, in addition to her previous accumulations, more than 300 million pounds of gold, apart from enormous quantities of silver. We 101 may presume that, if India ceases to demand fresh gold and begins to disgorge some part of her huge stock, she will do so gradually. Yet if the change comes at a time of big new production, she may involve the world, nevertheless, in a very great inflation of gold prices. If, however, India is thus to turn the tables on the West, she must not delay too long. The time may not be far distant when Europe, having perfected her mechanism of exchange on the basis of a gold standard, will find it possible to regulate her standard of value on a more rational and stable basis. It is not likely that we shall leave permanently the most intimate adjustments of our economic organism at the mercy of a lucky prospector, a new chemical process, or a change of ideas in Asia.